All right, what's going on, y'all? So welcome to another episode of Full Circle Podcast. It is your favorite brother, Joseph, as always. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I have shared a little bit about, but haven't gone in depth on. And I believe this is largely responsible for some of the political climate that we're seeing right now in the country. Today, we're going to talk about what's wrong with the Democratic Party. Why do they seem so weak right now in the face of obvious abuses and pretty much total disregard of the rule of law as well as the Constitution? We're going to talk about that today. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about where things stand with the U.S.-Ukraine relationship as well as what is going on in Russia. But before we do that, okay, I want you guys to go ahead, like this video, smash the subscribe button, and go ahead and leave us a comment if you love what's being shared here or if it's adding value to your life, if you're learning something about what's going on in the world and in the United States politics. And also feel free to follow us on social media at _Full Circle Pod on Instagram and Full Circle Pod on TikTok. As I always say every episode, it is free to support a nigga unless you want to do more. And once again, we always do genuinely appreciate it. Okay, so diving right into everything today, I want to just start with this. And I've written a couple of things down. But before the 2024 election, and of course I hadn't started my podcast before that time, right? But before the 2024 election, there were a lot of people that, you know, they knew Donald Trump was going to run again. They pretty much had assumed that he was going to be the nominee. But there was a very, very, I would say very, very popular thought that he would not be able to win this upcoming election. There are many people that said, oh, there are too many people that know about what he's doing that's wrong, and they're not going to put him back in office. Americans are too smart. Of course, the Democrats, during the beginnings of the the third Trump campaign, were saying, oh, you know, he's a danger to democracy, you know, and even further on into the campaign as it went, they were saying he's going to take away health care for certain people. He's going to try to implement Project 2025, which at the time, of course, Trump claimed was a lie. And we're now seeing Project 2025 is being implemented as part of policy. There were people that said that he was going to come after, he was going to use the Supreme Court to come after abortion rights and a woman's right to choose as well as healthcare rights. And they talked about voting rights. And of course, they were saying that he was going to take authoritarian and dictatorial measures. I could go on and on and on about the things that were talked about. Now, as we fast forward past November, we're almost a year. We're 2 months out from it being a year since the elections took place. Everything Democrats said would happen, and not even just Democrats, like any person who knows the economy, any person that studies history, any person that's followed this Trump administration can see clearly that everything that Democrats said would happen is happening. So the question is, why don't people trust the Democratic Party? With all that being said, right, and I'm not talking about, you know, the MAGA and people on the far right, but I'm talking about the general population, people that are just like you and me, in the middle in many ways, trying to live our daily lives. Why is it that many people agree with what a lot of Democrats have been saying, but yet they aren't showing up to the polls? They're not voting. The party is the most unpopular that it's been in about 50 years. What's going on? Well, we're going to talk about that today. Right now, the economy is showing a lot of signs of downturn, and they're showing a lot of unrest, especially from the growth that was being had when Joe Biden was president. Now, of course, there's obviously still been economic issues that we've been dealing with ever since COVID happened. And there's concerns about where the country's going now with the Trump tariffs that are in place. And of course, some of the actions like firing government officials and so on and so forth. But we're going to break down internal divisions, failed party messaging, and even the dishonest rhetoric from Trump that is still managing to capture the majority of participating voters as he continues to dominate the media with his blitzkrieg daily, whether it's True Social posts or press conferences, whatever name you. So we're going to start with that. First of all, what I want to talk to you guys about is the just the Democratic Party's popularity crisis. Okay, now let's just go to some facts here to start. The Democratic Party is currently facing its deepest favorability hole in 50 years, as I mentioned. Currently, congressional approval, as was reported here by Quinnipiac, they're saying that they are at 19%. Okay, that's Congress, 19%. The internal critique of the party is that 30% or 35% of Democrats are saying the party is weak and ineffective. There's mixed diagnoses, of course, on what's the cause of this problem. Some people say that the party is too woke, siding with everything from LGBTQ rights and wearing that on their sleeve to trans rights, all the way to DEI concerns, siding very, very strongly with women's rights, so on and so forth. There are some that are saying there's poor leadership, that Democrats are trying to toe the party line in a sense and trying to show this balanced narrative that, Democrats are still the party of, decent, fair, reasonable, how do you say, gentlemen or gentlewomen politics. Whereas the Republican Party and MAGA has become the party of bullying, where they will essentially like throw dust in your face and then try to box you while your eyes are shut, right? And so there are Democrats that are, in many ways, the critique is that Democrats try to toe the line and try to, have this both sides fair and balanced type of political engagement, when the Republican Party has not engaged in good faith in, recent political face-offs. Now, there, of course, are those that are more balanced, and they're just simply trying to do what's best for their constituents, and they're not the far right extreme of what we're seeing. But in many ways, MAGA has hijacked the Republican Party to the point that the Republican Party is now MAGA, okay? There are some that are also saying that this party underestimated Donald Trump, that they pandered more towards social issues than populism and giving the people what they truly want, that they were weak on the border, that instead of, still aiming to treat people that have come here to the United States illegally or that are undocumented, instead of aiming to treat them with respect while still being tough on enforcing border policies, there were some people that believed that the Democratic Party was too soft on the border and thought they would lose they would lose votes or public support because of this. And then, of course, we have to talk about the fact that in many ways, the Democratic Party has abandoned young men. There's not really been a message for young men, specifically Black and Latino men, but also there's this narrative that the Democratic Party has completely alienated white male voters. And we'll talk about that as well. But one of the biggest problems here is that Democrats often mobilize minority and special interest blocs to win elections, but then fail to pass meaningful legislation and materially improve these groups' lives or strengthen the middle class. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how the economics, it's a little confusing because the economics of Democratic presidencies actually showcase that the outcomes are better for not only minorities, but also just for the economy and the working class and the middle class as a whole when Democratic presidents are in power. But the problem with this is that in many ways, there's a lot of favorability crisis, identity politics versus policy delivery issues, and internal fragmentation. And I've talked about this before when it comes to purity testing, where in the Republican Party, you could be Candace Owens or you could be a Tulsi Gabbard, and you could used to be from like the far, you could used to be maybe more of a progressive or more someone's on the left, maybe even far left. But then if you defect and come into the Republican Party, you become a conservative talking head. The Republican Party welcomes you in. They almost see it as being a sign of failure. of the other party. And they'll look at it and say, listen, we don't care if you used to be a progressive or a far left or a leftist political pundit or politician. We welcome you into the party with open arms, and we almost see it as a sign of failure of the other party. Whereas the Democratic Party seems to purity test, which is basically a form of saying, do you hit every single status quo policy point and talking point that is popular within our party? If you don't get everything right, if you're not with us on every single thing, you're not welcome here. And what this leads to in many ways is a lack of other voices, variety of voices being able to contribute to the discussion. So the party, and I'm going to talk specifically about this more in a second, but I believe that one of the biggest problems that I have with the Democratic Party, even though I have, more recently voted, Democrat in these last couple of elections, me being more of an independent, one thing that I see that's been problematic is the usage of ideological groups, race groups, groups based off gender or based off of sexual orientation or identity to gain power and win elections or pander, but then does absolutely nothing to be effective or still keep sight of the fact that you are ruling the majority of the country. And you have to take into consideration what's happening in the majority of the country while you are putting these things forward. The big problem that I have with the Democratic Party, and I'll speak to this when it comes to race, as a black man who sees what's going on in this country, obviously a lot of Democratic narratives, policies, they are advertised or at least geared towards us in a way that seems very, very friendly, in a way that seems like they care, in a way that seems like they're reaching out to us. But if you look at particular candidates, for example, in this most recent election, you look at somebody like a Kamala Harris or you look at a Hillary Clinton, there's nothing wrong with, and I just for the record, I volunteered for the Harris campaign this past election cycle because I thought that what she was putting forth made more sense from a policy standpoint than what Trump was putting forth for a variety of reasons. But there's a lot of pandering. There's a lot of showing up to black churches. There's a lot of adopting certain ways of speaking and communicating, going and getting celebrities that match all different types of identities to come on and try to pander to us as a group of people. And there's a lot of putting forward of these faces. There's a lot of talk of the first female vice president or the first female president or the first black male president or the first black female this or Indian or just whatever, or the first gay, transgender, whatever have you. But at the end of the day, what you then see is not too many of people that look like us or know what's going on in our community actually being given full range to do things that impact the community and actually benefit it from our perspective. There's a lot of talk and there's a lot of rhetoric that is rousing and motivating. And I mean, if you look at it, the DNC just seems to be in many ways, when you look at some of these DNC speeches and videos, it's rousing and it's encouraging. And granted, in many ways, I support it in many ways because I see all of America showcased in it, because the RNC in many ways has pretty much just become, from what I see, a very, very, it becomes like a white American conservative talking head showcase with cherry-picked people of color, people that are gay, people that might even be trans, to basically showcase that there's some support for that. But the policies and the ideologies that are being put forward are not friendly to that of people of color historically, from what we've seen, and people of different sex and people of different sexual identities or sexual orientations. It doesn't seem to be that much in support of that. But the problem with this is we're not dumb. After a while, we began to look and we began to see the lack of legislation, the lack of projects that are created, the lack of policies that are being enacted to benefit the majority of our lives. And let's take it out of the realm of race. If you're a middle-class person in this country, you want to see policies that are being enacted that are going to benefit your quality of life, that are going to increase wages for you, that are going to create more job opportunities, that are going to create economic growth and stability, that are going to bring cost of living down, the cost of food, the cost of gas down. This is what we're looking for. But what we have continued to see, the rich people are getting richer in the country, poorer people are getting poorer, and the middle class has all but disappeared entirely. And so when we look at this, you begin to say, okay, stop preaching to us and pandering to us and give us something that's actually lasting, that actually we can see. Because at the end of the day, one thing about Donald Trump that I can say, I disagree with his policies and his rhetoric, but he is doing what he said he would do. He is passing executive orders. The Republican Party is completely and totally behind him on this. They're slamming through these disgusting, bloated bills that are full of tax incentives and breaks for the rich, that cut Medicare for nearly 16 million people, that completely disregards women's health issues and concerns, and that alienates in many ways the middle class and poor people in this country. Where are Democrats on this? There's a lot of silence. There's a lot of weakness. There's a lot of waiting and grasping and grappling for opportunities to basically make this situation go in your favor politically. And I believe that a lot of this is due to the fact that we have an election cycle every 2 years if you're in Congress. Of course, it's 6-year term if you're a senator. And then, of course, every 4 years if you're president, because the focus, I believe, becomes getting elected. The focus is not working for the people. The focus is not helping people. It's if we adopt this rhetoric or this ideology or this message, it may not be popular. And this very same thing is coming to bite a lot of Democrats in the butt. So let's talk a little bit about this from the standpoint of the 2024 election. Kamala Harris, I believe, started off very, very strong. First of all, we already know Joe Biden should have never run again for president. He was already too old. He was already showing signs of age decline. Even though a lot of his policies were helpful to the economy, you can just go ahead and look at how we got inflation down, even though it was still bad relative to other countries, which was a really terrible talking point. There was a lot done to bring about growth that was there to work with unions, encourage manufacturing, and of course, continue to build the country up from an industrial standpoint. However, the thing about it is that Kamala Harris drew, let's just look at the numbers, 11 million fewer votes than Joe Biden did in 2020. The working class, non-college educated, and Latino men specifically shifted towards Republicans. Most of this has to do with economic issues. If you are not making this about your identity and making it more about working and the economy, even if you're telling lies, that's what people want to hear. There was an overemphasis, I believe, on identity politics and culture messaging that neglected pocketbook concerns, financial and economic concerns like inflation, housing, and immigration. Now, granted, Kamala Harris did talk about a plan to help get people more people in homes because young people are doing a lot of renting. She did say that she wanted to have a plan for a lot of minority men, specifically to help them to start their own businesses. But there was a lot of concentration on the idea and not necessarily the policy that would make it happen. And so what you begin to see here is a lot of people, they're looking at this and they're saying, okay, where are the answers? What are we going to do to make this happen? How is this going to work? And like I said, even with strong economic numbers, a lot of voters moved away because they felt like their immediate needs were not being addressed. And there's just been this, there's been this shift in this disliking towards incumbents that has happened pretty much since the pandemic, where it's almost like the NBA right now, where it's like if you hire a coach and he doesn't get it done in a season or two, even if he takes you to the playoffs and even if you go to the finals, that same coach could get fired. And that's essentially what we are seeing here. Now, let's just look at the hard data here when it comes to the economy, right? Under Democratic presidents versus under Republican presidents, okay? The hard data is showing that Democratic presidents are consistently outperforming Republicans economically, right? So let me just take you to a couple of numbers here. This is from a variety of sources that I've combined here. Some of this is from the Economic Policy Institute, so you can go ahead and research all these numbers as well. When it comes to real GDP growth, when it comes to the Democratic Party, when Democrats are president, 3.79% of GDP growth is had versus 2.60% under Republican presidents. When it comes to total job growth annually, the Democratic Party gets 2.5% annually. And then when it comes to the Republican Party, it's just over 1% in total job growth annually. When it comes to private sector job growth, the Democratic Party gets Democratic presidents net 2.6% versus that of the Republican presidents, which is under 1%. Income growth, the bottom 20%, Democrats are at 2.1% of growth versus the GOP in the bottom 20% of 0.7% of growth there. There is historical job creation that's noted here, where with Democrats, the numbers are 70.5 million jobs created versus the GOP, which is $29.1 million. The per month average for that, if you look at jobs created per month, here is 164,000 jobs versus 61,000 jobs, which means that under Democrats, job growth and job creation is 2.4 times faster than that of Republican presidents. The economic record under Democrats is strong, but the problem with this is that perception has not caught up. And in many ways, Republicans have found a way to associate themselves with economic freedom and stability, labeling Democrats as communists, socialists, and radical left. But the numbers right now are not showing to be the same. If you look at it, even right now, Donald Trump has even basically said that he, in many ways, would take over the steel mill or subsidize parts of the steel industry to provide steel, which in many ways is a socialist movement because it is taking the means of production and putting it under government control, even if it's to a small degree. So the question then becomes, if this is the case, what's wrong? Why is the party not receiving support? Well, once again, I believe that the solid economic numbers are not translating to voter support because lived experience, when people are seeing that their wages are not going up, when people are seeing that they're getting laid off from work, when they're seeing that the Democratic Party seems to be talking more about these social issues than they are actually talking about economic issues and having clear messaging about cost, about healthcare, about housing, that in many ways becomes the focal point where they believe it's not a big issue, which I think Democrats should be talking more about their wins. But more importantly, the competing narratives of the populist left talking more about, hey, this is what we can do. In many ways, some of the progressive ideologies, people like AOC or people like Bernie, for example, or Mamdani, who right now is running in New York for mayor, versus centrist caution, people that are trying to be more moderate, be more careful, not trying to rock the boat. They've been more career politicians. A lot of this dilutes perceived success because of the infighting on messaging that's taking place in the party. The other aspect of this is that Republicans have just done a better job, if we're being honest, at having a strong conservative media ecosystem. From people like Benny Johnson and Joe Rogan, all the way to people like, there's just so many. I mean, we've got Ben Shapiro, and we've got all these particular talking heads out here that are making a stronger case for what is going on. But then there's also like conservative comedians like Andrew Scholes, right? Or people like Andrew Tate that are out here talking about these issues. And they do it in a way that doesn't seem so serious. It's more laid back. It kind of feels like it's your favorite podcaster. They're talking about life, and they have a way of shaping these very, very extreme or fringe ideas from the right as being normal, everyday, casual. The youth shifts that are taking place, especially through these conservative media hosts reaching out on TikTok and on YouTube and on Instagram, it's reaching younger people at a rate that no one's ever seen, while in many ways, Democrats are very, very slow to abandon legacy media like CNN and MSNBC and Fox for some of these now more independent media platforms and shows. There are some people that said that, who knows, Kamala Harris might have won more votes if she had gone on Joe Rogan's podcast and maybe didn't do as many interviews like 60 Minutes or, some of those interviews that are more part of legacy media. But at the end of the day, voters are looking at the numbers. I don't believe any one of these issues are single specific causes. I believe it's a conglomerate. But if we're being honest, voters are just looking at the numbers. They're judging what they feel. They're looking at their bank account. They're comparing what the economy looked like and what the conditions of their life looked like to how it was before. And they're saying something is not adding up. And then there's a lot of misinformation and just false narratives that are being propagated out there. So people are falling into trust what they know over what they're being told, or at least what they're feeling. At the end of the day, I believe that right now what's happening is that you're actually beginning to see this. And I mean, one example of this right now is, like I said, you've got one side of the party that's more like, hey, let's just kind of be calm, more like the Schumers of the world. You've got people out there that are more lifelong Democrats that have been in the party for a very, very long time that are basically like, okay, well, let's just kind of see how it goes. And, let's try to catch Trump on a blunder. Then you've got people that are working in their own states, like Governor Kathy Hochul, for example, over in her state, I believe of New Jersey, they're kind of more like, okay, well, let's just be a little more careful. Let's just be a little bit more, relaxed on how we go about this. Not because we don't care about, and she's actually the governor of New York, let me correct that, but not because we don't care about what's happening, but this could actually hurt funding for things that we need for our people in our state. And then there's this conversation about Democratic MAGA. There's a lot of people that are saying that Governor Gavin Newsom of California, my state, is beginning to behave in some ways kind of like MAGA, where Gavin Newsom, for example, will take a post and he will make a post in the tone of Donald Trump, but basically in his own way, touting the successes of either the Democratic Party or just making mock of Donald Trump using these posts. What I think is very interesting about this is that Democrats are now experimenting, as Donald Trump seems to just be steamrolling. They're experimenting with messaging and grassroots energy to try to regain traction by using some of the Republican Party's tactics. So they have become now more bold on populist rhetoric and populist ideology on TikToks, at rallies, and of course on legacy media interviews. But of course, if you're looking at it right now, a couple of examples of this. What I just said about Gavin Newsom. AOC is now raising more small dollar contributions than the Democratic Party. That's insane, right? Of course, Bernie and AOC went on this fighting oligarchy tour in places like Denver and New York and Los Angeles, and they had massive turnout because they're promoting progressive ideologies and populist ideologies that people want to hear. Right now, centrists are warning that imitating Trump without substance can cause backfire because you're not like the guy. This guy is a once-in-a-lifetime figure in politics, and the whole if you can't beat them, join them, or maybe not join them, but copy them, can actually backfire because you're losing a sense of morals and a sense of substance over the desire to gain support or to kind of have a gotcha burned a moment. And at the end of the day, the reason why this creates problems is if you become like Trump, if we become like Trump, if we start borrowing the tone and borrowing the bully behavior and mentality and strategy to then beat that team or beat that ideology, what does that say about us as a group of people? What does that say about Democrats as a party? And so I want to just share a couple of ideas that I have here that I believe that the Democratic Party can use to gain back trust. First of all, you need to admit that what we're currently doing, what the party is currently doing, has failed. You have to admit that this whole thing of going to black churches or trying to do the whole thing of, Latinx and all this other stuff, which most Latinos don't even like that terminology. They don't even buy it. That's like a very largely new thing. Trying to pander to groups of people, whether you're the LGBTQ community, the black community, the Latino community, Asian community, talking about women's issues, while it's important to talk about that and while we should be being more inclusive and while we should be for every man, woman, and child on this planet, pandering to those groups of people to get votes without having any substantive policies that you create and or subsequent follow through as a result of that is a strategy for defeat. Gone are the days of identity politics. Nobody cares if it's the first female or the first black or the first gay or transgender candidate to run for a position if they don't have anything substantive to say and substantive to bring to the concerns that are hurting Americans. And let me be clear on this. Americans are hurting right now. There are people right now that are laid off from work. They're struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their head for their families. They can't afford vacations. They can't afford relaxation. They can't even afford to put healthy food on the table, much less any kind of food on the table. They don't want to hear about your identity politics. They don't want to hear about a lot of these issues that are just being focused on. And let me be clear, trans issues matter. Trans people and gay people matter. It's important that we talk about that. But if you talk about that as the main and primary issue, that is a very small percentage of the country, not less important. Let me be clear. Not less important, because I already know there's going to be people that are going to hear this and think I'm saying that just because they're a smaller part of the population, they don't matter. They do matter. And a lot of the culture wars that are happening, even on the right, where they're basically blowing this up like they're like, oh, they want you to have it. You can have a sex change at school and come home a different. That's not even true, right? But at the end of the day, that cannot be so much of the priority that we don't understand how to number our priorities. And this is very basic and simple. My dad would always teach me this growing up. He'd be like, son, if you're stressed out about what to do first on your list of priorities, number them. At the end of the day in this country, we are governed by majority rule. And you have to focus on what the majority needs. Because at the end of the day, whether that person is black, they're Hispanic, they're gay, they're straight, lesbian, transgender, whatever, those people also care too about putting food on the table. They care about having dignity. They care about a reasonable wage. They care about having upward mobility in this society, especially if you're a millennial or you're Gen Z or even Gen Alpha and Gen Beta that's coming up. That's what people care about, not these cultural, contrived identity focuses and these culture war topics where we can't even have an honest debate. But more importantly, the Republican Party, in many ways, while they shut down a lot of other people and they have a lot of these hard stances on what they believe, they're willing to step into the fray and have debates and hear out other sides and points of view, even if they disagree, and even if they're not welcoming those sides in good faith. And in many ways, if we're being honest, the Democratic Party rather, And a lot of progressives and leftists and even liberals will not even welcome a conversation if somebody says something that even sounds like it's contradictory. What we're accusing the Republican Party and conservatives of doing, of shutting down free speech, in many ways, we're using cancel culture. We're canceling people and I don't get, like I said, I believe there's aspects of cancel culture that have been important because it has a level of accountability that's needed. But if somebody is talking as a parent and saying, hey, I'm concerned about what my kids are being taught in school, or if there's somebody out there that's saying, hey, while we do welcome and while we're I want to be an ally for the LGBTQ community, it doesn't mean that I don't have questions or I have thoughts about this, or maybe grew up in a particular way. I'm not going to swallow all these ideas whole. And being an ally does not mean that I'm completely embracing all of these ideas without questions, or admitting the fact that, hey, if you're a straight person, some of these ideas might be novel for you, or it might be a strange thing for you to wrap your head around, because it's also just not the majority in the country. And our country has not always been, and just our world has not always been friendly toward these ideas. If you interrupt and if you cut off people that have those conversations, or may even say the wrong things, but they're in pursuit, they're trying to have a good faith conversation, because we know the ones that are not. But if we're always saying that every single person that is attempting to do this is racist, sexist, transphobic, if a person says, listen, I'm a straight person and I don't date trans people, like it's not my thing, and we say that person's transphobic, what are we doing? You're not opening the space for people to have real conversations. And at the end of the day, if we're scared of narratives, if we're scared of showing kids things that are racist and sexist and vile, if our goal is not to teach people, expose them to it and say this is wrong, the answer is not censorship. The answer is not coddling. And to be honest, the answer to even hate speech is not hiding it and censorship. The answer to it is by having a culture of people that are educated. They can hear the negatives, they can hear the positives, they can hear the evils, and they can hear the things that elevate us as a people. And they are able, because of our education system, because of what we are implementing when it comes to critical thinking and the ability to know the difference between right and wrong and lean into our conscience as a people and as individuals. That's what we're going to need. So first of all, that's what we're going to need to do. We've got to welcome back the open debate without judgment into our society, because it's madness on both ends of parties right now. But the Republican Party looks really, really mad right now. And conservatives look really, really nuts right now with a lot of things that are coming through. And I don't mean necessarily just good faith conservatives, but I'm talking about the main messaging of the party right now. So that's number one. You need to have a clear narrative and welcome a bunch of people to have that conversation about what's shaping the next 20, 30, 40 years of the party looks like. We need to have builders versus extractors. But number two, we need to highlight GDP growth. We need to highlight jobs. We need to highlight bottom 20% income growth in relatable terms as a history for the party. And there needs to be fresh voices. And I'm not just talking about fresh voices and fresh faces, but also, and not just young people, because we need young people, but we need fresh ideas. Gone are the days of old politics and acceptability politics and respectability politics. We need to have strong voices that are pushing for radical, new, revolutionary ideas that are going to take this country forward. And we need to have voices that are going to not look at the country back in the days of old, but needs to look at the country where it is now. And just the same as we're saying, hey, listen, to Republicans, your Second Amendment policies don't make sense because we don't have muskets anymore. We have machine guns. We need to have common sense laws when it comes to guns. Well, we need to have common sense laws when it comes to our policies. We need to have common sense ideas when it comes to our policies that is going to fit the needs of right now, because young people right now, we don't have a lot of upward mobility. We're working hard. We're creating our own opportunities. But we need our government in many ways to create incentives for us to take hold of the leadership of the future, much like Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson did, back during their time to say, listen, there are things that are happening right now in our country due to the Great Depression and due to what is happening right now in terms of, the post-World War II era. How do we push the country forward? And then finally, what we really need to look at here is proactive policy, not reactionary politics, but we need to have proactive plans to look at Trump's patterns and say, we know this is how he operates. How do we counteract this? How do we get the messaging out there? How do we partner up with new creators and not just try to purity test everyone, but welcome debate and welcome rhetoric that might be uncomfortable, but is necessary for where we're going. I believe that doing well economically and just in messaging is not enough. You got to have clear, consistent messaging. And more importantly, you have to have policy follow through. Because while Donald Trump is out here following through on his promises, however con man structured they may be and detrimental to the future of the country, he's following through. And that's why his supporters in many ways continue to back him. Before I move on to the next topic here, I want to talk with you briefly about this from the perspective of a politician who in many ways has, risen in the Democratic Party. Pete Buttigieg was the mayor of South Bend and, of course, ran for president. I believe it was back in 2020 when Joe Biden was running for president. Of course, ultimately won that election, contrary to some people's unpopular and misinformed belief. But Pete Buttigieg was recently being interviewed by NPR about this topic and about what has happened with the Democratic Party. And I want to just go to a couple of clips of some things that he said, because I do believe that it will inform some of the topics that we are talking about today and how the Democratic Party can get back on track. But let's just start here. He talks a little bit about where the Democratic Party is. I'm going to go ahead and play this for you right now. Here we go.
Let me put a proposition on the table, and we'll see if you agree with it or not. I think it's possible to say, looking at the last election, looking at the last several years, that the country has changed, that politics have changed, that Republicans figured that out and captured the moment, and Democrats have failed to do so up to now. Do you agree with that?
I would mostly agree. Yeah. I think that Democrats have been slow to understand the changes in how people get their information.
Which is the primary problem. People are not watching, at least most young people, are not watching MSNBC, CNN, Fox. Just look at some of the commercials when you watch those channels. It's pretty obvious. But that's not where we're getting our information from. So you have to go straight to the sources. Let's continue.
Slow to understand some of the cultural changes that have been happening. And maybe most problematic of all, too attached to a status quo that has been failing us for a long time. Right now, you've got an administration that is burning down so many of the most important institutions that we have in this country, which is wrong. It is also wrong to imagine that we should have just kept everything going along the way it was.
And this is another thing that I actually did not mention that I do want to mention now, and I remember this. During the Harris campaign, there was a lot of, and I mean, while these statements are true, there was a lot of focus on what Donald Trump is going to do. He's going to take this away. Look over there. They're going to take away your abortion rights or your healthcare, women's healthcare rights, or they're going to ruin the economy. And there was this fear that people were being kind of like encouraged to experience to then motivate them. And then the narrative was, well, if you don't vote for a female president, which some of this is the case, it is the case. It's just a sexist point of view in the country. That is a valid point of view. But at the end of the day, if we're being honest and we're looking at it in many ways, you can't bully people into voting for and supporting you when you're not showing them something that's concrete and that showcases a plan. Because if you don't have a plan, how do you expect people to buy into what you're talking about? And so there was a lot of talk about, oh, this is what's going to happen. And if you don't do this, like, imagine who you're letting down. You're letting your mom down or your sisters down, or you're letting the people in your life around down. And there was just this whole narrative about all of that. And like I said before, if you're not offering anything, if there's no conversation where all you're doing, it should be painstakingly obvious what's wrong over here. But if you're not offering anything, people aren't going to fall for that. I hate to say it.
If our politics, our economy, and our culture were healthy, the rise of a figure like Donald Trump would never have happened in the first place.
That's right.
And I think that my party needs to do a better job of addressing the fundamental problems that have led people to mistrust everything and to anticipate what is going to happen next. Every defeated political campaign, but certainly my party right now.
As I mentioned before, you have to look at the patterns of what has happened, but then you have to have a long-term plan. And like I said, the Democratic Party has been very, very reactionary ever since Donald Trump has come to power. The media has done the same thing too. But this time around, they've been licking their wounds for a long time. And he's like, it's time to come up with a plan and move forward.
Is vulnerable to the temptation to fight the last war, to think about the last campaign. And we should learn from the last campaign. But we are already in a dramatically different world than we were 6 months ago, let alone 4 years ago. And that's about to change that much more, in my opinion, because of the rise of artificial intelligence. And I think even now, even though it's a hot topic and people are discussing it all the time, there's a lot of hype, I think even now we are underreacting.
So that's a really, really important thing. As I mentioned before, he says there's a lot of underreacting that's going on. And because of the underreacting to everything, that is giving people either a false sense of calm or it's actually pissing off a lot of people who can actually see the way that democracy and democratic norms are being unraveled. I want to skip a little bit over here to this section over here. He starts talking about populism and what the party needs to do in that regard. So we'll play that now.
You talked about the status quo and Democrats getting stuck defending the status quo. One of your fellow Democrats, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, has talked a lot about this recently. And I can summarize his argument by saying Democrats need to be more populist. We need to acknowledge that people are profoundly dissatisfied with the status quo. We also, as Democrats, he would say, need to be tearing things down, need to be talking about the very few people who seem to be benefiting in this situation.
Because right now, Republicans, as I mentioned before, they're talking about that. I mean, think about it. Donald Trump is coming in, basically when he was running for office, tearing things down, saying, look at what they're doing. They're taking your jobs. They're ruining your country. They're bringing crime. I'm going to do something to solve it. I'm going to impose tariffs. I'm going to end all these trade agreements. That's very revolutionary, tear it down language. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party just seems nervous to take any of those actions because I believe the Democratic Party is afraid of looking like what Republicans say they are, radical. But maybe the answer to this problem is to do just that. Take a chance on being radical, but in a way that benefits the American people. Go figure.
He also wants Democrats to be louder, a little more disruptive in government. What do you make of his approach?
I think it's certainly true that we can't be wedded to the old ways or the status quo. It is wrong to burn down the Department of Education. But I actually think it's also wrong to suppose that the Department of Education was just right in 2024.
That's right.
You could say the same thing about USAID. It is unconscionable.
Because in many ways, just to put this in here, in many ways what the Trump administration will do, they will point out real problems, like the Department of Education has had problems. Standardized testing has been a problem. Teachers are teaching to a test instead of actually teaching from a syllabus that is mostly primed to help students learn, and to do so in a way where their full passion can be realized. Also, teachers are just not being paid well enough. Teachers, in my opinion, should be being paid the same amount as lawyers, if not more, because they are the ones that educate the lawyers. They're the ones that educate the doctors. They're the ones that educate the people that are going to move the country forward in the future. For them to not be being paid reasonably, absolutely outrageous. But what he's basically saying here is like, hey, you got to draw attention to this stuff. It's important that it's important that if there's a problem, you can't just act like, oh, look at this guy. He's so extreme. He wants to tear down the institution without acknowledging we have problems and here are concrete ways to solve them that are just not as extreme as tearing everything down. Because what we've seen the Trump administration do and the Republican Party do is they basically will take something that's not as much of a problem. They fire a bunch of people. They defund everything. And then when everything goes defunct, they say, see, told you. It was a failure. Let's privatize it. And then they sell it to the this has been a consistent thing. Trump threatened to do this even with the post office. And when you defund stuff, when you leave things up to the states, they're going to focus on their highest priorities, which automatically leads to cuts in these things. And once again, if you take away the Department of Justice, we can clear, or the Department of Education rather, you can see who tries to come in and control and dominate the education space. Let's continue.
That children were left to die by the abrupt destruction of USAID. Unconscionable. It is also clear that USAID developed into something that nobody on a clean sheet would have designed the way it was. There were a lot of problems with development aid and how it was structured. Mm-hmm. My point is, it's wrong to burn these things down. But it's also wrong to suppose that if Democrats come back to power, our project should be to just tape the pieces together just the way that they were.
That's right.
We should be unsentimental about the things that don't work. We should be fearless in defending the things that do work. And yes, we should be naming the forces, entities, people, often corporations, who stand between a lot of Americans and a better, freer life.
And I believe in Pete Buttigieg is absolutely right about this. Democrats should not only be looking at what can work, or what has worked rather, but also what can work. And they should look at the areas where they say, listen, Republicans were right about this. There have been problems, maybe not fraud, waste, and abuse, but there are areas in which this is not efficient. And then let's propose a plan that would make these sectors of government that is supposed to serve the people more efficient. I'm going to go ahead and just skip right on over here to where he talks about the economy. And we're just going to do this very, very briefly here because I do want to move on to the next topic. But this is very, very important. So we'll start here.
How much of a disaster, from your point of view, is the administration creating by canceling so many projects in the middle, by ending subsidies for clean energy, on and on?
I think it's hugely costly. I think it would.
And Pete Buttigieg used to be the transportation secretary. So this is a conversation in many ways that is right up his alley.
Will destroy jobs. I think it's going to lead to, we already know it's leading to higher costs of living. Health insurance premiums are coming out for next year. They're higher because of the Trump budget. Prices obviously are higher. I think that's partly because of the Trump administration's policies. Interest rates are going to be higher because of how much they've added to the national debt to make room for these tax cuts for the wealthiest. Yeah. Jobs, take where I grew up, South Bend. One of the biggest things to happen, in fact, the biggest thing to happen in terms of a new auto industry investment since the 1960s, when Studebaker stopped making cars, is a facility going in St. Joe County to create electric vehicle batteries. It was, even just building it, even before it opens, has employed members of the building and construction trades in that part of Indiana where I grew up at a level not seen, I think, in my lifetime. Now the fate of that project and so many like it have been called into question in ways that are going to hurt our economy and, of course, also set us back in terms of dealing with climate change.
Have we surrendered?
So as you can see here, one of the things that is very, very important to note, and I'm just going to take it, back here because obviously I think this was very, very, important what he was saying. This is the same conversation essentially, even with what's been going on with the electric vehicle mandates where they basically are saying, hey, we need to make not just straight up gas powered vehicles. That's a good idea for the environment, obviously. But I believe that a lot of Americans, when Republicans get a hold of that messaging, they say, oh, look, they're trying to take away your gas powered vehicle freedom, your freedom to choose whatever vehicle you want. I believe if Democrats basically just say, hey, listen, we'll have an option where we're going to make more cars that are either hybrid powered or that are electric powered, because not everyone's just going to buy these cars straight up front, right? Like, it takes time. You will get more people on your side. But I think making the messaging where it feels like people have a choice, or where they know they have a choice, and their choice is actually going to benefit the future of the country, the environment, so on and so forth, that's what needs to happen. Instead of it just being this thing where they're not tightly basically wording the messaging and anticipating Republican talking points. And this was something that President Obama was very good at. President Obama was very good at addressing the opposition after he made a statement, before they even had time to basically respond back. So this is something very, very important that has to be looked at. Like I said, I just played that video for you so you can basically hear what I'm talking about, and how in many ways it backs up some of these ideas of what the Democratic Party needs to do to succeed. And like I said, I think we've got to get back to, as a nation, being more embracing of everybody's ideas and communication, even if it maybe rubs us wrong. We got to have more conversations, because ultimately when it comes to these voting blocks, these are people that we're looking to vote for one of our sides, whether it's Democrat, Republican. And the independent party is beginning to emerge, which many years ago, I was like, you're going to see the rise of the independent party. I wrote a whole paper about this. And we're now beginning to see, this past election, more non-party or independent of party affiliations were counted and demonstrated in this past election than ever before. So we've got to just get back to the heart of it, which is caring for the American people, taking care of their needs. And I believe the American people, we have to hold accountable our politicians and say, listen, if you're not seriously coming to the table after every election cycle with new plans and policies for us, we're not going to support you. We're going to stay home. And if you care more about winning elections, we are going to mobilize under that moniker and that ideology to make sure that you work for us, the people. So what do you think about all this? What are some of your thoughts and ideas about what's gone wrong with the Democratic Party, where they are right now, and what they can do to essentially come back and make things better on their end for the country? If you are a Democrat, or even if you're a Republican or an independent, what your thoughts are about what's been going on, go ahead and let me know. Leave me a DM at _fullcirclepod on Instagram, and go ahead and comment at fullcirclepod on TikTok. Like and subscribe to this video for a host of more content that'll be coming through. I want to hear from you. And I want to get your ideas on all of this, because once again, we've got to partner together when it comes to what is going on in our country, and let our officials know where we stand and make our voices loud and clear. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, what I want to do is shift over to what I mentioned earlier in the show with everything that's going on with the Ukraine, Russia, USA drama. Okay. So right now, as we can clearly tell, there has been a lot of back and forth and a lot of changing narratives about what Trump said would happen. At first, he said he would end the war before he even got into office. Then he said it would be on day one. Then he said he would do it in 2 weeks, which seems to be a very popular deadline for him, from everything from healthcare to just about coming up with some sort of an economic plan, concepts of a plan, as he said. And now what we're looking at is something that he said would take 100 days, or the first couple of months of his presidency, has now waned into the most of the year. Now we're almost to, fall time, and we're still looking at this war. Now, Trump's strategy in many ways with this has been to coddle Russia, to be very much in the sense of saying, hey, like, Russia didn't really start the war. He basically has blamed Ukraine for starting the war, which we obviously know is not true. And it's a little interesting to see that MAGA, in many ways, has been very quiet about this, when in other circumstances, they would say, look, Russia is not the kind of country that we want to be siding with, especially given their communist and really their socialist, more so communist points of view and the way that they run the country. I mean, it's a dictatorship that's run by contrived political releases, speeches, and of course, people that political rivals being taken out through claims of falling out of a window or, stabbing themselves 9 times. Go figure, right? But what we're looking at here is because Donald Trump has had a clear and present obsession with Vladimir Putin and the way that him and other dictators like him have run their countries, there has seemed to be, even from the start of the Trump campaign, this obsession with pandering towards and catering to Vladimir Putin, who's the president of Russia, instead of somebody who is an actual ally of the United States and a good faith actor in the region. Now, let me be clear. My statement of saying this is not in any way saying Ukraine does not have problems. Yes, Ukraine has problems with corruption, which President Zelensky has talked about this. Yes, Ukraine does have problems with aspects of governance. But when it comes to this war, what we can say without a doubt and without any sort of, confusion in our minds, right? We can say for a fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, some people might say unprovoked. Obviously, Russia has interest in the region, and Russia feels that if Ukraine gets invited into NATO as part of the alliance, that is going to threaten their interest because it would automatically mean a U.S. base being built right there in Ukraine, which is right on the doorstep of Russia. So in many ways, they would feel as though Russia would be a kind of third party, if you will, or they would be some sort of it would almost be like a pseudo situation because the United States can keep an eye on what's going on in Russia using Ukraine as a conduit. And so this, of course, has led to that. But also, Putin wants to restore the USSR, which Ukraine used to be part of. And we could see this because he annexed Crimea and invaded Georgia back when President Obama was in office. And so now Donald Trump, where he falls into all of this, Donald Trump in many ways is trying not to offend Putin while still kind of teeter-tottering on the edge of not fully saying we won't support Ukraine, but at the same time being hostile in the exchanges with Ukraine. And so basically a couple of weeks ago, and I wasn't able to talk about this because I was out of town and on vacation, but a couple of weeks ago, there were documents that were left behind at the Trump-Putin summit that have journalists and intelligence officials buzzing. Essentially, there was a resurfaced Oval Office document that was shown. Of course, we saw there was an argument between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, rather. And of course, what we're seeing is now a pivot that is taking place, that the U.S. seems to be kind of like on the fence or a little bit in the middle when before it seemed like they were more hostile. Now, at the end of the day, the Putin summit that happened in Alaska, there were documents left behind after the private summit with Putin that raised concerns about sensitive information exposure. There are some people that were concerned, of course this is alleged, but there are some people that were concerned that Trump might have shared more than what was necessary for Putin to know and might have given him an upper hand. And much of that conversation, there wasn't really a resolution. If anything, we rolled out the red carpet. I mean, there's literal footage of U.S. soldiers rolling out the red carpet for Putin as he was exiting his plane. And so this would have never happened under President Obama. We'd have never seen this, I even believe, under George W. Bush for all the issues that people had with him. There was just an understanding that Russia is not a good faith actor in any of the things that are occurring and that we should not be treating them as such, especially giving them deferential treatment in comparison to that of Ukraine, right? So what's happening right now is there's a question as to if there were any commitments that were made to Russia or any agreements that were made without Zelensky being present. And also, officials are reviewing what documents may have been inadvertently left behind. But this is sparking debate, much like what happened with the Houthi rebels and the Signal chat, as to how much this administration takes seriously security conversations. We know that Donald Trump, after he left the White House after his first term and was at Mar-a-Lago, he was showing classified documents to some of the top donors at some of his dinners. And so the concern now becomes, is this president concerned with actually having a resolution that allows Ukraine to have sovereignty but doesn't escalate conflict with Russia? Or is the concern appeasing Putin, and will Ukraine be able to get back all of the territory that it has lost as a result of this war? Now, we already know what happened back in February of this year where, we saw Trump being a little bit hostile, or not, maybe even a little bit hostile is not even the word. He was clearly being very hostile. I actually have a clip of that, and I want to show that to you, not because of the fact that you may have not heard about it, but I want to show it to you just for the context of what that relationship looked like. And I now want to show you what that looks like in, looking forward now in context of this video. I want to essentially show you what this exchange, parts of this exchange looked like. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up here.
What I liked most about...
Hold on one second. Of course, they're always playing these commercials here. And I'm going to go ahead and get that queued up. But it's very, very important to see context. And that's what we're aiming for here. So let me switch over. Okay. And here we go.
What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yeah, but
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring it into this country.
You should be thanking the President. Of course, the narrative is all bowing down before Trump and being so grateful that even he would be willing to help you, when this should fairly be a norm when we see that there's a bad faith actor involved. But let's keep watching.
To Ukraine that you say what problems we have.
I have been to. I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all,
Just absolutely embarrassing. This is like not even how foreign policy is supposed to. This is not a reality TV show. But once again, when you have a reality TV show background, you go figure.
during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless you.
Which he's making a solid point. He's basically saying, listen, you're separated from a lot of enemies and threats because of the distance that the United States has, because of, the Atlantic and the Pacific. We're essentially separated, and we're not surrounded by countries that want to do us harm in many ways. So Zelensky's making a solid point here, but look at what Trump says.
God bless you. God bless you. Will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
And I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good. We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position.
Okay, so you kind of get the point of what I'm talking about. At the end of the day, once again, just a lot of American arrogance and ignorance. But the bottom line is Donald Trump in many ways was saying in this situation, you don't have the right, him and J.D. Vance, you don't have the right to come in here and tell us what to do. You got to make these deals on your own if you don't do this. And Zelensky's just saying, listen, we need assurances. We're in the middle of a war. I'm trying to save my country here. At the end of the day, what's happening right now that seems to be very different is the United States seems to be coming around on this particular topic and saying that they are going to give certain security assurances to Ukraine. And meanwhile, Putin is still talking about peace and launching major military bombing offenses on Ukraine. So once again, they had a meeting in Brussels. Or they had a meeting in D.C. rather. There are allies that are in Brussels that are carefully watching what's going on. They're worried about America's commitment to Article 5. And at the same time, what's going on here is that European leaders are concerned about the shift in the narrative. Are you going to take a solid stance, or are you going to leave this open for interpretation? And this can have long-term implications for NATO and regional security and may embolden Russia and pressure Ukraine, who just wants to see the end of this conflict. And so what's happening right now, of course, we'll keep looking at this. But once again, this is destroying America's credibility on the public stage because there is no serious world leader who may even be facing the threat of war that's an ally of the United States that can securely say that if their country is invaded or if they have the prospect or threat of war on their shores or on their land, that the United States will honor its commitments and not stand on the side of dictators. And because of that, the United States in many ways is losing ground and looking weaker and weaker from a foreign policy standpoint and from a military standpoint, while other world powers like the UK and France and even Germany are starting to step up to the plate to show their support for democracy in Europe. So what do you think about all of this? I want to get some of your thoughts about it as we continue to monitor this. Go ahead, shoot me a DM on Instagram @_fullcirclepod. You can also go ahead and follow us there and on TikTok @fullcirclepod, as well as subscribing to this video, leaving a like and a comment and letting me know what your thoughts are. You never know, your comments could actually be featured in the next video as well. But feel free to let me know what you think. As always, that's all the time that I have for today, but have a great one from your favorite brother. We'll see y'all next time. Peace.